We're now we welcome our second panel, Mr. Siddharth Kara, the author and fellow Kara Center Program on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery at Harvard University, Dr. Mohammed Mattar, Executive Director of the Protection Project, Ms. Neha Misra, the Senior Specialist on Migration and Human Trafficking at the Solidarity Center, and Ms. Mary C. Ellison, Director of Policy at the Polaris Project. I thank you all for being here, and welcome your testimony. Your prepared remarks in their entirety will be put in the record if you want to summarize, but you feel free to do whatever you want. We'll begin with Mr. Kara. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank you. Chairman McGovern, and all the other members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for inviting me down from Harvard to testify today. Let me begin with the words of a debt bondage slave named Gaurav, whom I documented not long ago at a brick kiln in India. This is what he said to me. When I was 18, my father died and his debt was passed to me. No matter how hard I work, I am always in debt. I have taken so many loans through the years for my father's funeral, for food and water and cooking oil. When I was younger, there was a time when I was so desperate to be free of these debts. I took my family from here and went back to my home, but the landowner's men came to my village and forced us to return. They tied me to that tree over there and beat me. They electrocuted me and did not let me eat. I was still there, still tied to that tree, when they sold one of my daughters to a dalal, a trafficker. They said, "This is payment for the work you have not done since the day you tried to cheat us." I could not believe God had done this. You cannot imagine how much pain I felt. I never saw my daughter again. I have been researching human trafficking and forced labor in close to 30 countries around the world for the last 12 years. Gaurav's is one of many stories I've documented. My comments today are going to focus on some of the findings of my recently released second book, which focuses on the largely underexposed issue of bonded labor in South Asia. The first thing I'd like everyone to understand today is that bonded labor is by far the most extensive form of slavery in the world today. By that, I mean that roughly half of all the victims of forced labor and modern-day slavery around the world are bonded laborers in South Asia. Many of these individuals are children as young as 8 and 9 years of age. Even though bonded labor or debt bondage was once prevalent around the world and remains prevalent in many parts of the world, the phenomenon is concentrated in South Asia, where roughly 85% of, by my count, the 18 to 22 million debt bondage slaves can be found. However, even though the phenomenon is concentrated in South Asia, the products that are produced by these individuals are exported around the world. Some of the products made by bonded laborers and forced child laborers whose supply chains I have traced to retail sale in the United States include hand-woven carpets, frozen shrimp, apparel, such as in Bangladesh, rice, tea, granite, spices, cubic zirconia, and many more. For those of you who may not be familiar with bonded labor, Gaurav's words describe it well. It is a feudal mode of servile labor exploitation that involves the exploitive exchange of credit for labor. One individual who is invariably impoverished and outcast must borrow money or secure tenancy for basic survival from another party who exploits the debtor's poverty, isolation, and lack of rights to coerce him and often his family into working off a meager loan for years or a lifetime. The conditions in which these individuals are exploited can be as coercive and dehumanizing as the worst forms of old world chattel slavery. Let me explain more about this issue by way of 4 very brief case studies. The first involves the shrimp industry of Bangladesh, and we can talk about apparel during Q&A if you'd like. In southwestern Bangladesh, I documented debt bondage and very harsh forms of child labor in the shrimp farming industry. Destitute and very sickly children waded into parasite-infested rivers to catch baby shrimp, which were then sold to agricultural farmers who were caught in endless cycles of debt bondage to harvest the shrimp, which were then exported abroad. Shrimp is, of course, the largest seafood commodity in the world, and the United States is the largest importer of frozen shrimp. After about a month of extensive data gathering across the entire supply chain, I determined that roughly 1 out of 57 of all shrimp consumed in the world are tainted by bonded labor or child labor in Bangladesh alone, which is a relatively small exporter. This means that the average American unwittingly consumes 1 to 3 tainted shrimp each year just from Bangladesh. The second case study involves the hand-knotted carpet sector. Throughout northern India and Nepal, I have extensively documented hundreds of cases of deeply exploited bonded labor and child labor in the weaving of carpets exported abroad. The U.S. is the largest importer of hand-woven carpets from India to the tune of $300 million last year. I can say with confidence that at least 1/3 of carpets imported into the United States from India and Nepal are tainted by forced labor, child labor, or bonded labor. Let me read to you the words of a young boy named Arjun who was forced to work up to 18 hours a day in very harsh conditions to weave carpets that I documented were exported to the U.S. He said, "We were locked inside this shack where many boys were making carpets. Most days we were given only 1 break for eating and 1 break for toilet. If we tried to sleep, they would beat us. Sometimes they gave us pills so we could work all night." And on he went. The third case study involves a little-known phenomenon of debt bondage-based internal trafficking for outright domestic slavery in Nepal called the Kamlari system. In brief, outcast Tharu girls are sold off to traffickers around the age of 8, 9, or 10 and given tenancy and food as credit in exchange for up to 10 years of domestic servitude. Because they are outcast and impoverished, they are often severely exploited. Here's how a young girl named Nirmala described her ordeal to me. "I was 10 years old when I first went to work as Kamlari. There were 5 people in the home, and I did all the work 7 days a week. Sometimes the wife would beat me. The husband in the home would rape me. I slept on a mat on the floor. I only ate leftover food. I was in that home for 2 years without pay." The final case study I would like to share involves the Hari agricultural bonded laborers of the Sindh province of Pakistan. I'm short on time, so let me just say that these individuals described to me being traded like livestock between owners, having children sold to traffickers to discharge debts, and being locked in private prisons and tortured for displeasing their owners. Suffice it to say, the persistence of this kind of dehumanizing exploitation of impoverished minority groups must be eliminated. There is much that can and must be done to tackle the system of bonded labor that remains deeply entrenched in certain pockets of South Asia. The following 7 recommendations to the U.S. Congress would be a good start. First, appropriate funds for more research into the nature of bonded labor in general across the South Asian region. Allocate funds for more research into reliable supply chain tracing of key products exported from South Asia to the U.S. that might be tainted, such as those that I described. Engage in top-level diplomatic efforts with counterparts in South Asian countries to address the core deficiencies in the regional response to bonded labor and provide support to address them. Engage with industry in the U.S. to elevate standards for supply chain monitoring and cleansing. Include supply chain research, monitoring, cleansing, and strict corporate liability for tainted supply chains in the TVPA reauthorization. Allocate funds to expand vital prevention initiatives such as microcredit, vocational training, disaster relief, and rural education, especially for women and girls. And finally, I make an offer and welcome anyone to come with me to South Asia and see firsthand exactly what this issue looks like. I hope some of this information has been helpful, and I thank you again for the invitation to be here today.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and I appreciate it very much. We'll now hear from Dr. Matar. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me the honor of testifying before you today on behalf of the Protection Project at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies on the status of human trafficking in the Arab region. And I am really proud of the work of the Protection Project for the last 13 years or so on combating human trafficking in different Arab countries. Human trafficking takes many forms in the Arab world, including begging, domestic service, forced labor, temporary marriage, child marriage, sale of children for the purpose of adoption, prostitution, recruitment into armed forces like in Syria, Sudan, and South Sudan, and trafficking of organs. Unlike the US, one can observe that while there are cases of sex trafficking in the Arab world, most cases of trafficking are labor trafficking. And the most common form of labor trafficking in the Arab world is domestic service. I can say statistically 80-20%. We're talking about almost 80% of the cases, labor trafficking cases, 20% of the cases are sex trafficking cases. I am encouraged by the efforts that have been taken so far to combat the problem of human trafficking in the Arab world since the passage of the United Nations Protocol on Trafficking of 2000. All Arab countries, except Yemen and Comoros, are parties to the protocol. But despite the many steps forward, the challenges remain great, especially as the result of conflicts, including the war in Iraq, the fighting in Syria, and regional instability following the Arab Spring in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Bahrain, and Yemen. I believe that this instability created what I call a forced migration movement that is giving rise to more cases of human trafficking in the region. Consequently, the path is difficult. But I am proposing today before you 10 recommendations that I believe will contribute to existing mechanisms that have already been created to ensure their effective implementation. First, expand the role of civil society. And I define civil society to include 5 elements: academic institutions, corporations, the private sector, the media, religious institutions, and NGOs as well. That must function properly and freely without restrictions or limitations. Unfortunately, this is not the case in many Arab countries. NGOs do not have the freedom to function properly and freely. The second is to utilize the good principles of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. I am a big believer in the role of religion, especially in this part of the world, and especially now with the Islamist movement in almost every Arab country. Fatwas, legal opinions, issued by Muslim scholars should be encouraged to influence behavior and emphasize the role of religion in condemning human exploitation. Perhaps Muslim scholars can highlight how Islam protects women's rights and should make it clear that child marriage poses a threat to the health and education of our girls. We're getting mixed signals from many of these Arab countries on the position of Islamic law on early marriage and child marriage. Third, we have to move beyond specific anti-trafficking legislation to trafficking-related laws, including laws on child protection, violence against women, access to justice, access to information, and labor laws that do not discriminate against foreign labor and provide protection for domestic workers. Unfortunately, in almost every Arab country, labor law does not apply to domestic workers. They are left with no protection whatsoever. As I always argue, only when human rights are fully protected will human trafficking be successfully confronted and eliminated. Fourth, fill the gaps in the domestic legislative framework. What we witnessed the last 12 years or so since the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was a legislative movement. Now we have 13 Arab countries that have specific laws on combating human trafficking. Iraq had the most recent one. We should provide technical assistance to Tunisia, Yemen, Sudan, Palestine, Morocco, Libya, and Kuwait, who are currently drafting anti-trafficking legislation, and I believe that the US plays a significant role in providing technical assistance to parliamentarians all over the world. We have almost now 136, 137 laws thanks to the work of the US. Fifth, let's ratify the International Labour Convention number 189 on decent work for domestic workers. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned that, and I really support what you just said. This is really important, especially in the part of the world where domestic work is the dominant form of labor trafficking. Uruguay and the Philippines have ratified 189. Now it became international law. We should urge countries to ratify it. But that's not enough. We should also urge Arab countries to ratify ILO 181 on the liability of private employment agencies, including recruitment agencies. You mentioned corporate liability. Corporate criminal liability has to be emphasized along the lines of corporate social responsibility. We should emphasize both corporate criminal liability as well as corporate social responsibility. 6, let's cooperate with the League of Arab States. I know that the work of the US is always with individual countries. What I am proposing here is to work with the institution of the League of Arab States, especially that the League of Arab States just adopted an Arab strategy to combat human trafficking, a model law on combating human trafficking, and established a specific unit that will receive reports from Arab countries on the status of human trafficking. Now we're going to have the American report, the UN report, and we're going to have an Arab report. Now I think it's the time to work closely with the Arab League to enhance these enforcement mechanisms. 7, let's implement the Arab Charter on Human Rights. 11 Arab countries have already ratified the Arab Charter on Human Rights. Articles 9 and 10 prohibit human trafficking. We should, in accordance with Article 43 of the Arab Charter, interpret the Charter in accordance with international law, especially the UN Protocol on Human Trafficking. 8, let's work with human rights institutions to maintain combating human trafficking as a priority. Ambassador Ludo Baca mentioned that it is a priority for the Obama administration. We want to make sure that although there is unrest in the Arab world, we're still maintaining human trafficking, combating human trafficking as a priority in any human rights agenda in all these countries. I am encouraged by the newly adopted Egyptian constitution. I know there is a lot being said about the Egyptian constitution, but I like Article 71, my favorite article, because 71 prohibits human trafficking. For the first time in the history of constitutionalism in Egypt, we're going to have a constitution mandate making human trafficking a crime in accordance with the constitution. 9, let's enhance the capacity of domestic anti-trafficking units. As you know, few prosecutions, unlike here in the United States, have been reported. Our prosecutors in the Department of Justice in the United States can serve as a valuable asset in providing technical support in training prosecutors, judges, and law enforcement officials. Finally, let's educate law enforcement on the rights of victims of trafficking to ensure that they are not penalized for unlawful acts committed as a result of being trafficked. Unfortunately, in many of the Arab countries, what happens is that they arrest a victim of trafficking, they do not recognize the person as a victim of trafficking, and they put the person behind bar. This must change. Let me conclude by saying that the United States, through the TIP office and through the mechanisms embodied in the TIP report, has been instrumental in engaging the Arab governments in their efforts to combat human trafficking. This U.S. constructive engagement policy must continue, especially in light of the recent political developments in the region. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, and now we'll hear from Ms. Misra. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity for the Solidarity Center to present its perspective about human trafficking around the world. I also just wanted to say a special thank you to the staff of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. They've been very helpful in this whole process, so thank you to them. The Solidarity Center is an international labor rights NGO that promotes and protects worker rights globally, and we conduct programs to combat trafficking both in countries of origin and destination for trafficked workers. Our anti-trafficking programs span the globe, and while each country we work in has its own set of unique circumstances and problems, we found a few common themes. Human trafficking for labor exploitation and forced labor has at its core violations of worker rights and lack of labor standards and protections for workers. Whether it's low-wage workers in such sectors such as domestic work or construction, migrant workers toiling on palm oil plantations, or other marginalized workers such as poor women or child laborers, human trafficking is a worker rights issue because it's linked to various forms of labor exploitation, and it's one of the worst forms of worker abuse. And yet, trafficking for labor exploitation often goes undetected and gets much less attention. Immigration officials may categorize immigrant workers who are trafficked as undocumented workers and deport them. Police and labor inspectors may view involuntary servitude or debt bondage in sectors such as agriculture, construction, manual labor, and manufacturing as mere worker rights abuses, and therefore do little to remedy these abuses. As we noted earlier, the State Department's Trafficking in Persons Office, in its annual report, always talks about the fact that prosecutions for forced labor are far fewer than those for trafficking for sexual exploitation, and even those are low. And I was saying to your staff earlier that I like the fact that I'm going last because I always like to be able to comment on some of the things that I disagree about, what other people have said, but actually I've agreed with almost everything that everyone has said ahead of me. We've all pointed out that forced labor is actually a bigger problem than sexual exploitation around the world, and yet we're still seeing responses to it that are not going to the underlying causes of these labor abuses. And a lot of times when I give these presentations, I say things that aren't always popular, and I'm about to say a few of those now. But I really believe that if we want to end modern-day slavery, we want to end trafficking, we have to deal with the worker rights abuses that are the underlying causes of trafficking. 3 points I want to make during my time. One, we have to look at the particular vulnerability of migrant or immigrant workers to human trafficking. We've talked about, undocumented workers and understanding that workers who are smuggled or who are in a country without status, of course, are vulnerable to human trafficking. But we also have to look at the systems and processes that we're creating that are making migrant workers vulnerable to trafficking around the world. One of the big things that plays a role in that are non-immigrant visa programs around the world. Whether we call it the kafala system in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, in the Middle East, or even here in the United States, our non-immigrant visa programs, whether it's the H-1, the H-2 programs, all these programs are creating structural problems that make it easy to exploit migrant or immigrant workers. Common themes among these temporary migration programs are that usually workers are tied to a particular employer. If you tie a worker's visa to an employer when they're being abused, they cannot leave. Another common theme in these temporary migration programs is the use of labor recruiters, and Ambassador Dabaka talked about that earlier. But it can't be overemphasized. Labor recruiters are playing a huge role in the trafficking of workers around the world, including into the United States. I'm not sure how this happened, but it has now become accepted that the definition of work has changed. That if you want to work for somebody, you now have to pay for the privilege of working. It's my understanding that the work is really defined as I work, you pay me. That's changed now, and yet it's being accepted that it's okay to have to pay hundreds to thousands. I mean, we know cases of workers coming to the United States paying $20,000 to get a job. Again, I work, you're supposed to pay me. These recruitment fees are resulting in debt bondage, and a number of the anti-human trafficking organizations that we work with in the U.S. and abroad say that debt bondage is one of the largest problems that they're seeing in terms of human trafficking in the United States. We really need to do something about regulating foreign labor recruiters, including the elimination of fees. Ambassador DeBaca mentioned the executive order that President Obama signed in September. It made a huge leap forward in preventing trafficking by prohibiting all fees. We are very concerned that the bill that Senator Blumenthal put forward to end slavery in contracting allows up to 1 month of worker's salary as fees. We think that that's a little bit of a step backwards. The rest of the law is wonderful and puts forth some really good criminal provisions, but anything that puts into legislation allowing fees is a big problem in terms of human trafficking. The second thing I wanted to talk about was supply chains, and you asked about this earlier in terms of the Bangladesh fire. The Solidarity Center has an office in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and has been dealing with this unfortunate crisis since it happened. But in terms of human trafficking, when we think about supply chains, the same things that we were talking about in the 90s are coming up again. Codes of conduct, third-party independent monitoring. Solidarity Center and many immigrant and worker rights groups around the world have shown that that does not work. Codes of conduct are not enforceable. They're rarely monitored. It's not an effective way to make sure that there's not slavery in a supply chain. The same thing with third-party monitoring or independent auditing that goes on. The fire in Pakistan is a perfect example. A month before the fire, the factory was certified as safe, and yet 120 workers were killed in this factory. The Solidarity Center believes that the most effective way to eliminate forced labor, debt bondage, and other forms of slavery in supply chains is by empowering workers to have a voice in their workplace and supporting their right to organize and join unions. Again, I was going to say, said earlier that I was going to say some things that are unpopular. That's one of them. When I talk about human trafficking and then I talk about the right to organize, people often say to me that they don't see the connection. But really, if you want to make sure that there's not slavery in a supply chain, you have to make sure that the workers have representation, agency, and a voice in their own supply chain to be able to monitor it. And that's a huge thing. The other unpopular thing that I say is that corporations need to be held accountable for mapping their supply chain. I've heard over and over again by companies how hard it is to map their supply chain. We're a small NGO. We did a report in 2007 called The True Cost of Shrimp about the shrimp industry in Thailand and Bangladesh. And through our partners, who are even smaller NGOs and unions in Thailand, we were able to track the supply chain for shrimp from the bottom of the supply chain in Thailand all the way to retailers in the United States. If we can do it as a small NGO, if our partners can do it, corporations can do it, and they should be forced to. The other thing is that pricing structures, when employers and buyers demand cheap or unrealistic pricing structures, they shouldn't be surprised that they're going to find labor abuses, including slavery, in their supply chains. And so we need to look at the price pressures that are being put all along supply chains. Similarly, when employers contract out or hire unregulated subcontracted suppliers, they should not be surprised to find that they have human trafficking in their supply chains. Another issue in terms of supply chain monitoring is that the Department of Homeland Security is charged with making sure that products made with forced or child labor are not imported to the United States. One of the problems with that is that when DHS does an investigation overseas about whether a product's made with forced labor or trafficked labor, they have to notify a government that they're coming. And then, of course, we all know what happens when you notify somebody that you're about to do an investigation. Supply chains are cleaned. One of the recommendations that we have is that ICE should be able to use evidence by local NGOs, unions, other counterparts who have first-hand knowledge of this to be able to show that products are coming into the U.S. made with forced labor. The other recommendations that we have are to ensure that workers are covered by labor laws. Professor Matar mentioned this for domestic workers, but we see for all sorts of workers, especially workers in the informal economy or migrant workers, they are often not covered by labor law protections, and this makes it very easy to exploit them. Another thing that we see is that labor inspectors need to be used more to combat trafficking. When people think about combating trafficking, they often think of customs and border officials, but we really need to ensure that labor inspectors play a greater role. As an example, Qatar is going to be hosting the World Cup in 2022. The private sector in Qatar is made up of more than 90% of the private sector is made up of migrant workers. They expect to have at least 1 million more migrant workers come into the country to help build all the stadiums and infrastructure that's going to need to go along with the World Cup. with all these migrant workers coming in, Qatar has something around 40 labor inspectors. If you're going to have over 2 million migrant workers in a country and only 40 labor inspectors, it's going to make it very, very easy to exploit people. The last thing that I'll just end with is that I think the U.S. government has a great role to play in helping countries around the world to negotiate stronger positions and more protections for their migrant workers. As an example, I worked for 5 years in our office in Indonesia, excuse me, where millions of migrant workers migrate each year. The Indonesian government negotiates bilateral agreements with countries such as Malaysia. These bilateral agreements, though, are often very weak. They actually have said in them that you can take a worker's passport. They've said that domestic workers do not have to have a day off. Because Indonesia is competing with other low-wage or developing countries for their workers to be able to go abroad, they're not very likely to push for strong protections. And so one of the things that we recommend is that the U.S. government should provide support to countries of origin, especially developing countries, to negotiate multilateral agreements with more powerful destination countries to level the playing field for migrant workers. If they can do it as a cluster, if Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Nepal can negotiate together, it's more likely that they would have stronger protections for their workers. You said it earlier, Mr. Chairman, but we really do need to pass the Trafficking Victim Protection Reauthorization Act as soon as possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your testimony. And last but certainly not least, Ms. Mary Ellison, the Director of Policy at the Polaris Project.
Mr. Co-Chair McGovern, and to the staff of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, thank you for holding this hearing on one of the most pressing human rights issues of our time, human trafficking and modern-day slavery. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today about its impact in the United States. I am the Director of Policy for Polaris Project, a nonprofit organization founded in 2002 and guided by a singular vision: a world without slavery. We advocate for stronger federal and state laws, operate the National Human Trafficking Resource Center Hotline, or NHTRC, conduct trainings, and provide vital services to our clients. International human trafficking and forced labor affect every country in the world, and the United States is no exception. The International Labor Organization estimates that there are 20.9 million victims of forced labor at any given time. We also know that trafficking victims are rarely identified. According to the 2012 U.S. Trafficking in Persons Report, only 41,210 victims were identified in 2011 around the world, or less than 1% of that 20.9 million. The NHTRC has identified more than 3,000 cases referencing foreign nationals in the United States from scores of countries, as well as potential trafficking cases in over 97 countries around the world. In 2011, 48% of our cases involved some form of labor exploitation or labor trafficking, and 52% involved sex trafficking. The 5 most common types of labor trafficking were domestic work, restaurant and food services, small business, agriculture, and construction. Polaris Project and our partner organizations here in the U.S. and around the world have been able to identify and assist trafficking victims because the U.S. has created a framework to prevent human trafficking, protect trafficking victims, and prosecute human traffickers. It is called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or TVPA. The TVPA is the premier federal law, but it is more than a year overdue for reauthorization. In the more than 10 years since the passage of the TVPA, we have made great strides, but we still have miles to go to prevent the exploitation and enslavement of vulnerable populations. We are particularly concerned about those who often fall prey to traffickers and labor recruiters abusing the H-1B, H-2A, H-2B, A3, G5, K1, D1, and H3 visa programs. We have identified more than 1,400 cases of labor exploitation or trafficking in agriculture, factories, construction, carnivals, embassies, and international organizations through these visa programs. I will make recommendations to address these abuses at the end of my testimony. In addition to doing a better job to prevent human trafficking and modern-day slavery, more can still be done to ensure that we better respond to those whose exploitation and enslavement we did not prevent. Today at Polaris Project, we are serving 73 trafficking survivors, 60 of whom are foreign nationals. One of them is Jennifer, a 30-year-old Guatemalan woman who came to the United States 5 years ago. She began working as a waitress at a restaurant where the owner and staff seemed welcoming. She hoped to be able to provide for her two children and ailing mother. Because Jennifer had nowhere to live, the owner allowed her to sleep in a room at the back of the restaurant. Within 2 months, however, the owner had fired the cook and other waitress. Jennifer was coerced into working 14 hours every day for 8 to 9 months, until one day the police conducted an undercover operation. Whether or not a situation like this will end in freedom and dignity for trafficking survivors depends on many factors. First, we must identify the 99% of trafficking victims who remain invisible and isolated. We have begun to do this through successful models like the NHTRC and the State Department's Know Your Rights pamphlet. Second, we need to provide safe and secure housing for survivors. This past year, we conducted a survey and found only 678 beds exclusively designated for human trafficking survivors here in the United States. Third, foreign national trafficking victims need access to benefits and services. We could improve the time frame for granting continued presence, CP, and ensure greater access to the T visa, given that only 557 victims were granted this visa in fiscal year 11, despite an annual cap of 5,000. Again, I will make further recommendations at the end of my testimony. But first, let me tell you how Jennifer's story ends, or shall I say, begins. Her case illustrates what happens when the system responds effectively. The police officer who conducted the raid recognized the human trafficking indicators and referred her to a local shelter that contacted Polaris Project for emergency services. Jennifer was fed and housed in our transitional housing program. She participated in courses to learn English and computer skills and also received proper medical attention. She was granted continued presence, which allowed her to find a stable job. She has since found her own housing and supports her mother and children in her home country. With the help of a pro bono attorney secured by Polaris Project, Jennifer's T visa application was submitted, and she now awaits her decision. Mr. Co-Chair, thank you for holding this hearing at a time when our struggle to prevent and respond to human trafficking and modern-day slavery could not be more critical. We are celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. As Ambassador Sidibaka frequently notes, we must still fulfill the promise of that proclamation and of the 13th Amendment. In concluding, we urge you to take the following steps, and there are 7. Reauthorize the TVPA and increase appropriations. Conduct a comprehensive review of the visa programs discussed. Address the lack of housing for trafficking victims. Encourage agencies to revise regulations related to continued presence and T visas. Protect the rights of domestic workers. Prevent child and forced labor in imported products. And finally, pass additional legislation to address the role of labor recruiters, corporate supply chains, and government procurement. We are eager to work with you to make these improvements to our law because they stand as a model for the rest of the world, and most importantly, because these laws create the road back to freedom and dignity for survivors of human trafficking and modern-day slavery. Thank you.